Aurora Kane stood motionless in the center of the tribunal chamber, her hands bound in glowing restraints that pulsed faintly with each beat of her heart. The crystalline walls of the chamber reflected distorted versions of her defiant face, amplifying her isolation. The elders, encased in their high, luminescent thrones, watched her from above, their expressions cold and detached. They spoke of justice, of order, but everyone present knew the truth. This was about power, control, and silencing anyone brave enough to resist. "Aurora Kane," the head elder began, his voice an emotionless rumble that reverberated through the vast chamber. "You stand accused of inciting rebellion against the sovereign colony of Eros 7, of attacking the sovereign guard, and of threatening the delicate order that ensures the survival of our people. For these crimes, you are sentenced to exile." The words hung in the air like a death knell. The crowd of onlookers packed into the chamber's balconies erupted in whispers and murmurs. Aurora tilted her chin upward, refusing to show the fear crawling under her skin. She had known this was coming the moment she had raised her weapon against the enforcers. They had come to her settlement to take food, water, and supplies under the guise of protection taxes, leaving her community to starve. She had stood her ground, fought back, and made the mistake of leaving one of them bloodied. Now she would pay the price. "Your place of banishment," the elder continued, "shall be the Wolf Quadrant." A hush fell over the chamber. Even the most hardened citizens of Eros 7 recoiled at the mention of the Wolf Quadrant. Aurora's stomach tightened, but she forced herself not to react. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Wolf Quadrant wasn't a place. It was a graveyard disguised as a wasteland. A distant, hostile corner of the galaxy where every creature, plant, and rock seemed specifically designed to kill. Those sentenced there didn't last long. Days if they were lucky, hours if they weren't. The head elder leaned forward, his crystalline throne humming softly with his movements. His expression, carved from years of absolute authority, was unreadable. "Survival is unlikely." Aurora stared up at him, refusing to flinch under his gaze. "Good," she said, her voice steady. "Then I won't have to suffer your corruption for much longer." A ripple of shock moved through the room, followed by scattered gasps and murmurs. The head elder's expression didn't change, but Aurora caught the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He gestured toward the guards at her sides, and they stepped forward, gripping her arms and dragging her toward the portal at the center of the chamber. The portal buzzed with unstable energy, a swirling vortex of light and shadows. Aurora felt the hairs on her arms rise as they approached, her skin prickling from the sheer power radiating off it. She had never seen a portal of this magnitude up close. It wasn't just a transport device, it was a weapon. "This is what happens to traitors," the elder declared, addressing the crowd. "Let this serve as a warning to all who would dare defy the sovereignty of our set." Aurora twisted her neck to glare up at him one last time. "You should be careful what you feed the wolves," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Sometimes they bite back." Without waiting for a response, she turned her gaze forward and stepped into the portal. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. It was as though her body was being stretched, unraveled, and reassembled all at once. Light and sound blurred together in a cacophony that made her head spin. She clenched her teeth, willing herself to endure the disorientation. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. She landed hard on jagged ground, her breath knocked from her lungs. For a moment she lay still, her body aching from the impact. The air around her was thick and heavy, carrying a metallic tang that burned her throat with every breath. Slowly she pushed herself onto her hands and knees, coughing as she tried to orient herself. The world around her was unlike anything she had ever seen. The sky above was a bruised, swirling purple, with two massive moons casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Jagged mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks obscured by dark, churning clouds. The ground beneath her was rough and uneven, crisscrossed with veins of bioluminescent light that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. The air hummed with an unnatural energy, making her skin crawl. Aurora rose to her feet, wincing at the sharp pain in her ribs. Her restraints had disintegrated upon her arrival, leaving her hands free but trembling slightly from the residual energy. She looked around, her instincts screaming at her to find cover. The stories about the Wolf Quadrant had been vague, but one thing was clear: this place was not safe. A low growl cut through the silence, freezing her in place. Her heart pounded as she turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows. At first she saw nothing. Then a pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the darkness, followed by a hulking figure that made her stomach drop. The creature was massive, easily the size of a small transport vehicle. Its fur was sleek and black, shimmering like liquid in the moonlight. Its claws were long and razor-sharp, and its teeth glinted like obsidian daggers. But it was the way it moved that unnerved her the most. Smooth and deliberate, with a predatory grace that made it clear it wasn't just hunting, it was toying with her. Aurora took a cautious step back, her mind racing. She had no weapons, no tools, no way to defend herself. The creature growled again, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. It was testing her, waiting for her to make a move. Her eyes darted to the ground, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. She spotted a sharp fragment of rock and lunged for it, her fingers closing around the jagged edge just as the creature pounced. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws, and scrambled to her feet. The beast snarled, its eyes blazing with fury. Aurora didn't hesitate. She gripped the rock tightly and lunged forward, driving it into the creature's throat with all her strength. The beast let out a guttural roar, its black blood spraying across the ground. It staggered back, clawing at the wound. But it wasn't dead. Not yet. Adrenaline surged through her as she turned and ran, her boots pounding against the uneven ground. Her lungs burned, and her muscles screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She could hear the creature's heavy footsteps behind her, its growls growing louder with each passing second. The landscape blurred as she sprinted, her focus narrowing to survival. She spotted a cluster of jagged rock formations ahead and veered toward them, hoping they would provide some semblance of cover. She slipped between the narrow crevices, her heart pounding as she pressed herself against the cold stone. The creature's snarls echoed through the air, but it didn't follow. It circled the rocks for a moment before letting out a frustrated roar and retreating into the shadows. Aurora slid down the rock face, her body trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Her hands were bloodied from gripping the sharp rock, and her ribs ached from the impact of her landing. But she was alive. For now, the distant howls of other creatures echoed across the landscape, a chilling reminder that the Wolf Quadrant was far from empty. Aurora knew she couldn't stay here long. She needed food, water, and a way to defend herself if she was going to survive. The tribunal had sent her here to die, but she wasn't ready to give them the satisfaction. She stared out at the alien terrain, her jaw tightening as a fire ignited in her chest. They had tossed her into the wolf den, expecting her to cower and perish. But Aurora Kane wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. And if the tribunal thought they could break her, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The days bled together in a relentless haze of survival. Aurora quickly learned that the Wolf Quadrant was as much a test of endurance as it was a battlefield. Each day was a fight for her life, and each night was a gauntlet of terror that demanded she adapt or die. She had scavenged enough to craft rudimentary weapons, a spear made from a shard of crystal embedded in the ground, its edges honed against jagged rocks. A makeshift blade fashioned from a fragment of metal she'd found lodged in the trunk of an alien tree. They were crude, but they were hers, and they gave her a semblance of control. Hunger gnawed at her, a constant companion. The first day she had tried to eat one of the vibrant purple fruits hanging from a low-hanging vine. It had tasted sweet, almost too sweet, and within minutes her throat had closed, her stomach twisting violently. She'd spent the next several hours doubled over in agony, unable to do anything but writhe on the ground, her body rejecting whatever toxins the fruit had carried. After that, she was more cautious. Through trial and error, she identified a handful of edible plants, bitter roots that made her lips numb but filled her stomach, and a type of spiny leaf that oozed a sour, sticky sap when crushed. Meat was another matter entirely. The creatures of the quadrant were predators, each one more vicious and cunning than the last. Hunting them felt like an impossible task. Bataille de pollo. But Aurora was nothing if not stubborn. It was on the fourth day that she managed her first kill. She'd been crouched in the dense underbrush, her body still and her spear poised, watching a smaller creature drink from a pool of shimmering liquid. The beast resembled a lizard, though its scales were iridescent and its body seemed to ripple in and out of focus like heat waves on a summer day. She waited until it lowered its guard, its elongated neck dipping into the water, before she struck. Slowly the animal slunk out. The spear pierced its side and the creature let out a high-pitched screech, flailing wildly. Aurora held on, using all her strength to drive the weapon deeper until the beast finally stilled. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the spear free, black ichor dripping from its tip. She stared down at the creature's lifeless form, a mixture of relief and guilt washing over her. The meat had been tough and gamey, the taste bitter and slightly metallic, but it had kept her alive. Each kill became easier after that. Her survival instincts sharpened, and her movements grew more deliberate. She learned to read the terrain, to notice the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled approaching danger, and to use the alien environment to her advantage. The wolf quadrant was a crucible, forging her into something harder, stronger, and more ruthless with every passing day. But it wasn't just the environment she had to contend with. The creatures weren't just mindless predators, they were intelligent. They watched her, studied her, and tested her defenses. She could feel their eyes on her, glowing pinpricks in the darkness, waiting for her to falter. It was on the seventh night that she encountered her greatest challenge yet. The air was thick and heavy, the sky a deep indigo streaked with flashes of lightning that illuminated the jagged peaks in the distance. Aurora had found shelter in a narrow cave carved into the base of a cliff, its entrance concealed by a tangle of thorny vines. She had built a small fire from dried moss and brittle branches, its weak glow barely enough to hold back the encroaching darkness. She was sharpening her blade when she felt it, a subtle tremor beneath her feet, barely perceptible at first but growing steadily stronger. Her grip on the blade tightened as she rose to her feet, her senses on high alert. The tremor stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant growl that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Aurora's heart pounded as she stepped toward the entrance of the cave, peering through the vines. The creature that emerged from the shadows was unlike anything she had faced before. It was massive, its sleek metallic fur shimmering like liquid silver in the dim light. Its eyes burned with an intense golden glow, and its claws left scorched marks on the ground with every step. Its movements were deliberate, almost regal, and it exuded an aura of power that made her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just another predator, this was the Alpha. The beast stopped just outside the cave, its glowing eyes locking onto hers through the tangled vines. It growled again, the sound low and rumbling, filled with both challenge and warning. Aurora's instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew there was no point. The Alpha wasn't here to chase her, it was here to test her. She stepped forward, her blade in one hand and her spear in the other. Her muscles were tense, every fiber of her being coiled like a spring. The Alpha tilted its head slightly, as if assessing her, before letting out a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath her feet. Then it lunged. Aurora barely had time to react. She dove to the side, the Alpha's massive claws slicing through the air where she had stood moments before. She rolled to her feet, her blade raised and slashed at its side as it passed. The weapon connected, but the creature's metallic fur absorbed most of the impact, leaving only a shallow cut. The Alpha snarled, its golden eyes blazing as it turned to face her again. It charged, its movements unnervingly fast for something so large. Aurora planted her feet, gripping her spear tightly, and thrust it forward as the beast closed the distance. The spear struck its chest, but instead of piercing through, it snapped in half under the force of the impact. Aurora stumbled back, her heart sinking as she realized just how outmatched she was. The Alpha growled, swiping at her with one massive paw. She barely managed to duck, the claws missing her head by inches. She scrambled backward, her mind racing. She needed to be smarter, to use the terrain to her advantage. The Alpha was bigger and stronger, but it wasn't invincible. Aurora led the creature toward the rocky outcropping at the edge of the cliff, using its size against it. The narrow paths forced it to slow down, giving her precious seconds to strike and retreat. She darted between the rocks, landing small blows whenever she could, chipping away at its defenses. The battle was brutal and unrelenting, each exchange pushing her closer to her limits. Her muscles burned and her breaths came in ragged gasps, but she refused to give up. The Alpha was relentless, its roars echoing across the landscape as it continued to press the attack. Finally, she saw an opening. The beast lunged at her, its claws outstretched, and she ducked under its swing, driving her blade into its exposed underbelly. The Alpha let out a pained roar, its golden eyes flashing as it staggered back. Aurora didn't let up. She followed the attack with a swift strike to its leg, forcing it to collapse onto one knee. The creature snarled, its massive frame trembling as it struggled to rise. Aurora raised her blade, her entire body shaking with exhaustion, and drove it down into the Alpha's chest with all the strength she had left. The beast let out one final, mournful howl before falling silent. Aurora staggered back, her chest heaving as she stared down at the lifeless form of the Alpha. Her hands were slick with its black blood, and her body felt like it was about to collapse. But she had done it. She had won. As she watched, the Alpha's body began to glow, its metallic fur dissolving into golden light that swirled around her. She gasped as the energy sank into her skin, a surge of power flooding through her veins. Her senses sharpened, her wounds healed, and her exhaustion faded, replaced by a newfound strength. She looked down at her hands, her eyes widening as she saw the faint golden glow emanating from her skin. She could feel the power of the Alpha coursing through her, its presence a steady, reassuring hum in the back of her mind. Aurora turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the jagged peaks of the Wolf Quadrant stretched out before her. She was no longer just a survivor. She was something more. They had tossed her into the wolf den, expecting her to die. But now she was the apex predator. The transformation was unlike anything Aurora had ever experienced. The golden light that had once surrounded the Alpha now burned within her, radiating out through her very being. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, a rush of power that felt untamed and wild, threatening to consume her if she wasn't careful. But instead of fear, she embraced it, harnessing the energy as though it had always belonged to her. The world around her seemed sharper, clearer. She could hear the subtle crackle of distant storms and the faint rustle of creatures moving in the brush. Her vision, once limited to the faint glow of bioluminescent plants in the darkness, now pierced the shadows with ease. She flexed her fingers, marveling at the faint golden shimmer that traced her veins, her newfound strength humming just beneath her skin. But with power came responsibility. The Wolf Quadrant was still hostile, and the creatures that inhabited it hadn't vanished with the Alpha's death. If anything, they had become more active, their restless howls echoing through the valleys. Aurora could sense them now in a way she hadn't before, as though the Alpha's instincts had fused with her own. She could feel their presence in the back of her mind, a web of faint pulses that told her where they lurked, waiting for their chance to strike. She had little time to reflect on her victory. The quadrant demanded her constant attention, and surviving one battle didn't guarantee safety in the next. With the Alpha's death, she had gained power, yes, but it also meant she had drawn the attention of every predator in the region. She was no longer just prey, she was a threat, and threats didn't go unnoticed. The first test of her newfound strength came just hours after the Alpha's demise. As she made her way across a vast plain of shimmering crystals, she felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. It wasn't the subtle vibration she had felt before. This was something larger, more deliberate. She stopped, crouching low as she scanned the horizon. In the distance she saw it. a massive insectoid creature with gleaming black carapace and legs like jagged spears. Its multifaceted eyes glowed a sickly green, and its mandibles clicked together in a rhythmic, menacing pattern. It moved with unnerving speed, skittering across the crystal field in her direction. Aurora tightened her grip on the blade she had reforged from the remnants of her broken spear. She could feel the creature's hunger, its intent to claim her as its next meal. But she wasn't the same woman who had stumbled into the quadrant days ago. She had faced the Alpha and lived. This insectoid monstrosity was nothing compared. When it lunged, she was ready. Her enhanced reflexes allowed her to sidestep its attack with ease, her blade flashing in the dim light as she slashed at its exposed underbelly. The creature screeched, its high-pitched wail splitting the air as it reeled back. But Aurora didn't stop. She pressed the attack, weaving around its flailing limbs and striking with precision. The battle was brutal, but it was over quickly. The creature's massive body collapsed to the ground, its legs twitching as its green blood seeped into the crystalline terrain. Aurora stood over it, her chest heaving, the faint glow of her golden veins pulsing with the rhythm of her heartbeat. She felt no triumph, only grim satisfaction. The Wolf Quadrant wasn't a place for victory celebrations. It was a place where survival itself was the only reward. Over the next several days, Aurora continued to explore the quadrant, her strength growing with each encounter. The creatures she faced became more cunning, their attacks more coordinated, as though the quadrant itself was testing her limits. But she refused to back down. She had become something more than human, something more than the tribunal on Eros 7 could have ever imagined. When the conflict split, her side had stood this violence, or all violence. The real challenge came when she stumbled upon the ruins. It had started as a faint glimmer on the horizon, a flicker of light that seemed out of place in the endless wilderness. Intrigued, Aurora had followed it, trekking across miles of harsh terrain until she reached a massive structure buried in the side of a mountain. The ruins were ancient, their surfaces worn and cracked. But the faint glow of energy still pulsed through their veins like blood through a body. Aurora approached cautiously, her instincts on high alert. The air around the ruins was different, thicker, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She stepped through a broken archway, her blade drawn, and entered a vast chamber that seemed to hum with life. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, their designs flowing and organic, depicting scenes of creatures both familiar and alien. In the center of the chamber stood a massive obelisk, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly with golden light. Aurora felt a strange pull toward it, as though it was calling to her. She stepped closer, her hand outstretched, and the moment her fingers brushed the surface of the obelisk, the chamber came alive. Light flooded the room, and the carvings on the walls began to shift and move, their stories unfolding before her eyes. She saw images of warriors clad in golden armor, their bodies radiating the same light that now pulsed within her. They fought against monstrous creatures, their battles fierce and unrelenting, until one by one they fell. Aurora realized with a sinking feeling that the warriors weren't just fighting for survival. They were protecting something the ruins had been built to guard. The obelisk began to hum, and a voice echoed in her mind, deep and resonant. It wasn't a language she recognized, but somehow she understood. "You are chosen." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She stepped back, her hand dropping from the obelisk as the light dimmed. She didn't know what it meant to be chosen, but she had a sinking suspicion that the ruins had been waiting for someone like her, for someone who carried the Alpha's power. Before she could dwell on it further, a deafening roar shook the chamber. Aurora spun around, her blade raised as a massive creature emerged from the shadows. It was unlike anything she had seen before, its form constantly shifting and flickering as though it couldn't decide on a single shape. Its eyes burned with a chaotic light, and its movements were erratic, almost frenzied. Aurora didn't hesitate. She charged forward, her blade cutting through the air as she met the creature head-on. The battle was unlike any she had fought before. The creature's shifting form made it difficult to predict its attacks, and its sheer size and strength forced her to rely on every ounce of her enhanced abilities. The fight pushed her to her limits, her body aching with the strain of each blow. But she refused to give up. She couldn't. The ruins weren't just a relic of the past, they were a warning, a reminder of what was at stake. With a final desperate surge of strength, Aurora drove her blade into the creature's core. The air around it seemed to ripple and distort as it let out a deafening scream, its body disintegrating into a cloud of energy that swirled around her before dissipating. Aurora dropped to her knees, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The chamber was silent once more, the obelisk's glow faint but steady. She looked up at it, her mind racing with questions. The Wolf Quadrant had always been a place of exile, a graveyard for the unwanted and the rebellious. But now she realized it was something more. It was a proving ground, a place where the strong were forged and the weak were culled. Aurora rose to her feet, her resolve hardening. The tribunal had sent her here to die, but they had unwittingly made her into something far more dangerous. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was evolving. And when the time came, she would make sure they understood the cost of underestimating her.